Nice. All right, take it away, Brian. All yours.
Okay, thank you. So the subject of today's webinar is the book that the HIWeather project of WMO, World Weather Research Program, has put together, called Towards the Perfect Warning. So my, no. Yeah, my, the outline of the afternoon. I'm going to give a very short introduction, and then Anna Scolobig is going to talk about the user end of the warning chain. Joanne Robbins will talk about the fulcrum, where we move from the hazard to the impact, and then I will finish off, if there's time, with some material from the book on predicting the weather. So, well, warnings matter. Warnings matter because they give people time to protect their lives, property, livelihoods, and essential services from weather-related hazards. In the HIWeather project, we have used this concept of the warning chain, which we call the 5 valleys of death. The mountains represent expertise in different disciplines, different organizations, but as the information gets passed between those experts, those organizations, it gets lost. And so we need to build bridges between them, and those represent partnership between organizations, between different disciplines. And that's not easy to achieve. Different disciplines, different organizations have different languages, different cultures. So it requires work. The warning process has to be designed with the problem that is to be solved, the decision that has to be taken as the starting point. But in the situation where an emergency is happening, it has to operate fast without the information getting lost along the way. So I've had a look at a range of disasters in 2021, and in this table, I don't expect you to read it, but the stronger, the heavier the green, the deeper, the darker the shading, the more effective that part of the warning was. And as we move to the right, we're moving from the weather to the hazard, to the impact, to the warning, and to the response. And you can see that at the response end, in every case, there were substantial weaknesses, and this is across developing countries, across different types of hazard, though principally floods and heat waves. So what the 3 talks we've got will address is how we can build a warning system that doesn't lose this information along the way. And I think so I'll hand over now to Anna, and if you can play her video, that would be great. How do I need to stop sharing.
Yeah, and then Robert, yeah, will be able to share the video from Anna. So Anna is here to answer questions, but due to an unstable internet connection, she pre-recorded her presentation. Robbie, it looks
good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, and welcome everyone to this short introduction to one of the book chapters that is focused on how can we better connect warnings with the decision and action, and how can we build or improve communicators and users of warnings. So this chapter is the result of a collaboration.
Oh, did we lose it, Robbie?
My Zoom just crashed and I don't know if I'm back or not.
You're back. Yeah. So
Okay,
if you can
yes,
reshare it, that would be good.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. Yeah.
Evening and welcome everyone to this short introduction to one of the book chapters that is focused on how can we better connect warnings with the decision and action, and how can we build or improve existing partnerships between communicators and users of warnings. So this chapter is the result of a collaboration with many co-authors, 10 of them coming from 9 different countries, and we all tried to synthesize our knowledge and experiences in the warning value chain. So before I begin with the presentation, let me first deeply thank the RiskKAN webinar organizers and also our book editor, Brian Golding. I'm really sorry not to be with you live due to some technical issues. So, but let's begin. I just want to bring you back for a moment to the conceptual warning cycle that was the guidance for our book writing, and that Brian already introduced and presented to you. In this chapter, we focus on the 2 last valley of deaths. And as you can see, this is the domain of behavioral psychology, communication, and social sciences, where, you know, bridging this gap between warning and action is one of the main challenges. And as you can see, we are in deep waters in some way here, and there are some sharks. Let's see some examples of sharks, or better, of problems that one can encounter when he's trying to bridge this gap between warning and action. So here there is an excerpt of a flood post-event report that highlights how people often lack knowledge that is needed to translate the warning information that they receive into an appraisal of risk and appropriate behaviors. Another post-event report, in this case, we are in the US after Superstorm Sandy, that was preceded by accurate forecasts and widespread warnings, but failed to trigger appropriate protective behaviors that experts recommended and were hoping to see. So why is it so difficult then to translate a warning into action? So there are many different reasons, and there has been extensive research on all the key aspects that make this bridge so difficult. So first of all, we don't entirely know how does information affect the behavior, and what type of information affects what type of behavior, more or less effective. Another issue is that people often, if we focus on the user perspective, they receive inconsistent or contradictory information. So how to deal with this inconsistency? Who should we trust? Of course, there are issues of communication, of scientific uncertainty. There are issues of responsibility that often hinder these processes. Who is responsible to communicate what to whom? So we have to look here into the whole warning value chain. And ultimately, one of the key questions is what is responsible communication, how we can co-design and co-produce better warning systems. So our chapter that tried to address all these challenges and it is structured around 3 core sections. The first one addresses the needs of the receiver. Here you see what are some of the key contents in the slide of this section. And during the presentation, I will have time only to focus on one of them, the behavioral influences on decision-making. This is a core topic where there are still a lot of knowledge gaps. We have a second section focused on the capabilities of the warner. And here we have been describing different types of warning, communication channels, but also the influences on the warner. And finally, the bridge between warner and receiver. And this section is really focused on, how we can build a relationship that go beyond the simple exchange of information between the warners and the users. And how also can we evaluate and measure the success of a warning? Across the chapter, we will travel in different countries. We have case studies from Argentina, Germany, Nepal, the United States. And I really invite you to read the chapter as soon as it will be available, open access online, together with the entire book in May. But let's now focus on some of the core challenges in connecting warning to decisions. So first of all, it's important to emphasize that it's not only about the quality of the warning message and its characteristics, but there are a number of other factors that influence the adoption of effective behaviors. Here you can see some of them displayed. They include the characteristic of the receivers, if a person is disabled or not, their age, if it's a child or an adult, but also their level of risk awareness, economic and social resources. So all these aspects, together with environmental, social, and contextual aspects, influence our capabilities to respond proactively to warnings. There is also important aspect linked to the effectiveness of the messages that should not be forgotten if we want to bridge this gap between action and warning. And here, some of the key information elements to be considered are obviously the source of information that needs to be included in a message, in a warning message, the location, the time, but also information about the impacts and also where people can find more information. Literature is extensive on the type of content and style of the message. So we should avoid uncertainties as much as possible. We should be as specific, as consistent, as accurate as possible, and as clear as possible in an ideal world. But also it's important that when we design a message, receivers are involved in the planning and development and testing of these messages. What does this mean in practice? We have an example here from Argentina, where the receivers, in this case emergency managers, have been involved in the design of innovative or new warning messages. This design began with an analysis of the needs and of the perception and understanding of emergency managers. And here below in the picture, you can see how decision makers were given all the same weather warning in text format, and they had to draw interpretations on a map of the country. So this type of exercise allowed to identify that there were difficulties in understanding, for example, coverage areas and phenomena, little effectiveness also in communicating spatial variations in severity, and also the overly technical language in the message text was highlighted as a difficulty to really understand what the text meant. As a result, several changes have been implemented by the Argentinian Meteorological Office, like simplification with interoperable messages in traffic light formats, also a new phenomena categorization together with the publication of warning thresholds. Also a permanent unit for assessing the needs and the understanding of the receivers have been set up to better evaluate communication and warning messages. So this and many other experiences tell us that it's important to take into account that the warning communication is a process, it's not a product. It's about establishing relationships with the receivers as much as possible, despite the difficulties, because there is a wide array of possible receiver of the warning information. And also it's important to emphasize that communication does not exist in isolation, and partnerships have to be built keeping in mind that there are multiple stakeholders involved that provide multiple type of messages and use multiple type of communication channels, but also keeping in mind that there are multiple versions also of the warning for the same type of event. So all this complexity needs to be taken into account, and this is why, for example, the common alerting protocol and other formats are very helpful to drive and guide warning communication efforts. So here we can see an example of a good practice of partnerships between the public and private sector, but also across different disciplines. So the Weather Ready Nation and Global Weather Enterprise are indeed two practices that we present for the engagement of experts with different disciplinary background to improve warning communication effectiveness. So if we want an effective warning value chain, we do not only need to involve meteorologists, but there is a need to involve also behavioral and communication scientists, but also to involve the public and increasingly the private sector, and promote open data and better ways to deliver information in a timely and relevant manner. So in our chapter, we also address some of the key changes and transformation that the communication has been facing in the past decade. As you can see in these pictures, you know, in a matter of a decade, the situation has changed completely. Now everybody has a smartphone where, you know, multiple sources of information can be found, and this needs to be taken into account. So we allow some of the dilemmas in the use of social media that include, for example, the difficulties to evaluate the credibility and the validity of user-generated content. There are also a number of ethical dilemmas, like the breaches of privacy, lack of consent, surveillance, unequal access to social media, that are some of the challenges in building effective partnerships. And also there is this increase in inconsistent or sometimes inaccurate information, infodemics, and this the phenomena have been studied, and there is an agreement that people tend more and more to rely on some specific sources of information, what is called echo chambers of epistemic bubbles, and it's very difficult to break these chambers. So that's why it's very important to build trust relationship with the users and receivers to avoid that these echo chambers are providing, for example, wrong or inaccurate information. There are also a number of opportunities that we need to better exploit linked to the digitalization of our societies. For example, there is opportunities for a provision of safety checks, recommendation in real time, and to improve agencies' capacities to interact with the public. There is also an opportunity linked to this reciprocal support of, for example, citizen scientists or crowdsource information. Information from social media or from smartphone application can be used for verification and evaluation. They can be used for targeting as well. For example, building on models of online advertising used by several companies nowadays. And also there is an opportunity to collect data more systematically, for example, about public behaviors. So one of our last section, and this is really coming to a closure of the presentation, is linked to the measuring of the monitoring and evaluation of warning communication, as well as measuring success. And here we highlight some of the new opportunities as well offered, for example, by smartphone application that allow to evaluate behavioral change and effectiveness in real time, for example, through surveys, and to learn more about how decisions and actions are linked to a specific type of warnings. And there are a number of criteria that can be used for evaluate the effectiveness of communication. For example, information, knowledge, and behaviors related criteria, but also criteria related to the structural factors and how people receive information and use them. So to summarize, here I present some of the key messages that we have been delivering, trying to deliver in our chapter. So first of all, it's important that the warning to decision process is considered not only as an exchange of information, but also as a establishment of a relationship between the warner and the users. And the effectiveness of warning depends on attention to both these aspects. So therefore, knowledge is necessary, but is not sufficient to guarantee that warnings are acted upon. Engagement, analysis of stakeholder needs, and resources are necessary to really improve our warning capacities and to co-design or co-plan warning messages and more generally warning systems that are more effective. We have been also addressing a number of factors that affects behavioral response and that affect this connection between warning with action. And we have been discussing also the importance of cross-agency and multi-sector cooperation, of targeting warnings for different groups that may have different needs, and analyzing these needs is the first step to go in this direction. And we have been finally also discussing the importance of using effective monitoring and evaluation tool now with the new opportunities provided by online communication and social media, and for ex-post communication evaluation should become really a standard practice, so that we can learn more and overcome the last valley of death. So many thanks for your attention, really, and for joining this webinar. Let me finally thank one last time all the co-authors of this chapter and the book editor for a fantastic book writing experience. And I hope that you will have all the opportunity to read soon this book. Many thanks.
Great, thanks. That was a very interesting presentation. I think now I'll hand over to Joanne Robbins.
Thanks, that's great. I'll just share screen.
Yep.
Hopefully you can see that, and it's now in full screen mode.
Yeah, now it is. Yeah, perfect.
Excellent, thank you. So thanks to Brian and Anna for the introduction there. This sets it up perfectly for me to give an overview of chapter 5, which focuses on connecting hazard and impact. So the structure of my overview will mirror the structure of the chapter. So I'll start with a very brief intro, and then we'll move into an outline of the approaches to impact forecasting and the link with hazard forecasting capabilities. I'll then round off very quickly with some practical considerations for bridging the gap between impact forecaster and hazard forecaster. So just by way of introduction, I just want to highlight where impact forecasting sits. And as you can see, bang smack in the middle of the warning chain. This has really big implications for the bridges, obviously, but also for the mechanism by which it's influenced by the upstream and the downstream elements. So as Anna highlighted, it's really important that we consider the user need, the style of the warning that will be practically useful to them, and also the desired actions that need to be taken, and therefore the impact forecast needs to address those needs. However, it's not only a consideration of need, there's also what is actually available to support the development of impact forecasts. And so this is why we have arrows in this diagram that go backwards and forwards. I also want to just briefly, before we move into the more detailed discussion, highlight the difference in terms of what we mean by impact here. Impact can be described as direct or indirect, tangible or intangible. And it's really important to consider those differences when we go forward with developing impact forecasts, particularly with regard to the user need, but also what is actually available from the weather and hazard and then impact assessment approach. I've also put in here the difference between micro impacts, so micro scale impacts, and macro. And the reason for that is that, again, depending on the need and what is actually available from observations and modeling capacity, you may not be able to address both of these elements. And so it's important to consider what is the most valuable components for the messaging and the desired actions you want to take. So obviously, one of the key criteria is that when we're moving into impact forecasting is understanding what makes something both hazardous and impactful. And to do that, it's critical that we have impact data. Now, this is obviously seen as a critical requirement for impact forecasting, unsurprisingly. And often we have an issue around the availability of such data. Now, in reality, I don't think it's a case necessarily of lack of information as such. It's more to do with the volume of data and the formats and variety of different data sources that might be available. So from the diagram here on the left-hand side, you can see that there's a plethora of different types of impact source information that might be available. That's aside from local level information, health data, hospital admission information, fire service information as well. So it is important to consider what data might be most appropriate for the impact forecasting tool that you would like to develop. It's also really important to consider the ethical and access constraints, and that will have an influence on what you are then capable of doing in terms of the impact modelling space. Following on from that, I think that one of the key things to be mindful of is that even when we're talking about observations of impact data, it's important to consider the observation and how that needs to be processed to be useful. And also be mindful of the biases. I mean, I think we're all fairly aware that depending on the data source, you might have a very skewed distribution in terms of the observations that are recorded. In the two examples I've given on the right-hand side here, one is a report that comes from sort of a relief web or a disaster management agency, and the bottom shows some Twitter activity information. In both cases, they would need processing into some sort of format that could be routinely used. On that note, there is also the case of harmonizing information on how you would do that, and subsequently how that then influences applications. And I think the key thing to address here is when we're talking about impact data and also impact forecasting, there are lots of people involved in this space. So partnership is really key. And we'll touch on that a little bit when we come into the bridging element later on. And the chapter goes into quite a bit of detail about where impact forecasting might be most relevant to sit, not necessarily within a Met service, but perhaps within a specialist in the health sector, maybe. So maybe an organisation like Public Health England in the UK, or maybe it sits more with the disaster manager. And I think there are discussions to be had around where this may best be, where this may best sit. Obviously, in the context of early warning, particularly around weather hazards, there is still a requirement for National Met Services to support that development. And so it's about understanding the governance structure between those groups. So obviously, thinking about the hazard to impact pathway, one of the key aspects we need to look at is the relationship between hazard and impact. Within the chapter, we sort of break down a lot of different methodologies, and we split them into three categories. So one is looking around impacts on people and different approaches that can be applied there. Another is impacts on services, and then the final one is around financial impacts. And there are differences in the types of methodology you might want to use here. But one of the key things across all of them is that the aim is to identify the right set of predictors. And that is essential when you move into the forward modelling space. So here is just a very brief illustration for what might be considered quite a simple problem in some respects. But here we have a hazard, which might be flooding, for example, and how we might then describe that hazard. Now, obviously, these elements, so precipitation intensity, duration, soil moisture, the catchment morphology, these might influence what type of hazard that we have there. Is it going to be a slow flood? Is it going to be a fast flood? Is it a flash flood, for example? On the impact side, we have to consider all of these other aspects like time of day, the demographic, the values of the individuals receiving messaging. Now, when it comes to understanding this relationship, the approach by which we try to understand that can vary depending on the data availability. One way is through statistical analysis. Another might be through process-based methods. Another might be primary data collection. So in some circumstances, it can be very simple to, well, not simple, but there can be a very direct link. So we have seen through the aviation sector, when there was issues with volcanic ash, that through experimentation, they were able to identify envelopes with which engines would perform better or worse given different volumes of volcanic ash. So the identification of these relationships and the method by which you do it can vary depending on the data that's available. And again, the key thing here is to really understand the cause and effect relationship, because without that, it's very difficult to go into the forward modeling step. So what the main underpinning requirements that we've highlighted here are for the impact modeler obviously are around the reliable description of the hazard, and that obviously comes from those upstream elements, and a way of describing those consequences. Now I've got an illustration on the right hand side here, which is from a piece of work that's just been done under the SHEAR programme, but it just highlights the variability in the different types of impact forecasting process that can take place. And one of the things we talk about in great detail in the chapter is which methods might be most appropriate given the strength and completeness of the hazard to impact relationship, but also the requirement of the user. These might differ in that case. So for example, it may be appropriate that just the use of a threshold that's impact oriented might be the most effective way of communicating whether there is or isn't an impact. However, if a user needs to do a prioritization and they need to know where they need to put specific actions related to certain types of impact, then we might need something more sophisticated. That might include the inclusion of vulnerability or exposure data, or it might be a fully dynamic risk model that tries to capture all those components. And again, this comes back to things like what is the resolution of the data that was used both at the beginning when we were developing that cause and effect relationship, but also how do you want the output to be produced and at what resolution, and how timely does it need to be for the users? And again, as we mentioned throughout, this data availability question is really important, particularly thinking about what will a hazard actually look like here? How will we be able to describe it effectively and then propagate that through to be able to understand the impact assessment? So focusing very much now just on the capabilities of the hazard forecast, we're really trying to understand what the capability is with regard to the impact assessment. Now, it might sound obvious, but impact prediction requires relevant hazard information, and that's not always standard from model outputs. So for example, if we need to know for the impact, we may need to know the velocity of the water that's flowing down a slope. We may need to know the run-out length of a landslide. We may need to know where there is a lightning strike on the ground, less so its position in the cloud. And so we need to understand what is actually available from the hazard forecast. Similarly, it's important to recognise that hazard forecasts vary in their capability across hazards. And with those limitations, there is an encouragement to use probabilistic approaches. Now, again, that introduces challenges when we try and combine and then also propagate uncertainties through into the impact assessment. And again, it will depend on the methodology you choose to use in the impact forecast as to how that can be accomplished. Similarly, it's also important to think about the lead time of the hazard prediction. We know that for certain hazards, the lead time is very short. So will you be able to bolt on an additional impact assessment if it's very technically or computationally heavy? And similarly, how does that then materialize in terms of the warning capability and the decision that can be taken? So all of these things have a really important aspect in identifying or influencing how the impact forecast can be produced. And then similarly, we need to really look at the hazard forecast from when we're evaluating it from the perspective of the user. And similarly, this talks to the fact that it's not just a case of knowing whether the hazard can be forecast accurately, but also its influence on whether we are able to forecast the impact accurately as well. So it needs to be a joined up partnership between those elements, and also that downstream question too. So this is sort of my final slide. The last part of the chapter really focuses on the practical implementation processes that can be achieved to bridge that gap between the hazard and the impact forecaster. We have a couple of examples, two of which I've highlighted here. One is the Australian Heat Health Partnership, and the other is the Joint Agency Modelling Partnership. In both cases, it's very clear that there are common things that need to be addressed to support the bridging of these elements. Language, terminology very clearly need to be similar, or at least recognized between the two sets of organizations or partners. There also needs to be a shared understanding of the user need, and that's not always the case when you consider what a hazard forecaster might think is important and what an impact forecaster might consider is important to the user. And so bringing all of those components together, again, with the users in the room, is really important. Because we're dealing with a lot of information when we're moving into the hazard and impact space, it's really important to have governance structures to understand the roles and responsibilities of people that are involved. And also to ensure that there is buy-in. It's often a good idea to have an element of advocacy in there. There could be occasions where there are people who are less clear on the value of why are we doing this? Why am I being brought into this assessment? Why is my organisation part of this, and why is it valuable? And I think having that evidence base and a bit of advocacy can really support that growing going forward. Going back a little bit to the governance structures, the data needs and management are really critical here, because we are bringing together sources of information from very different organizations in some cases. We're sharing information that we may not have shared before, and there needs to be a building of trust across that as well. And similarly, I think this came out a little bit earlier with the discussion around the different types of impact forecasts that can be achieved. It's really important to consider what the capacity of organizations is to actually achieve this endeavor, and to be realistic about the different approaches and how that might then be resourced, both in time, money, and also in terms of your longevity, particularly considering, again, those data needs and management. So that's a very whistle-stop tour through what is in chapter 5, but I hope it's whet your appetite for reading the chapter in more detail. And with that, I'll hand over to Brian to talk about the hazard and weather forecasting elements.
Thanks, Joanne. That was a very nice introduction of your chapter. And Brian, with an eye on the clock, maybe if you can keep it to 5 minutes, then we also leave some time for questions. If people have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. And also for people who joined a bit later, I'll add the link in the chat to our YouTube channel where we upload all of our presentations. Okay, Brian, floor is yours. And you're muted, so you'll need to unmute. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Yes, so I'm going to talk about predicting the weather, a partnership of observation scientists and forecasters. So to reiterate something that Joe mentioned at the beginning, the predictability of the weather is an important part of the chain, and it actually provides the foundation for early warning of weather-related hazards. We need to understand what is predictable and when it's predictable, if we're to know what sort of warnings are possible. So observations and numerical weather prediction model outputs are shared globally. Some countries mainly contribute observations, Some mainly contribute predictions. Some mostly use other people's predictions, and some mostly use other people's observations. Nobody can do it all in isolation. So it's very much an essentially partnership-based activity. So following the chapter structure, as in the other two chapters, I'm going to talk first about forecasting methods, then about capabilities of observations, and then finish off with a case study or two, depending on time. So numerical weather prediction is founded on observations. It uses the equations of physics in the atmosphere, which are solved using massive supercomputers. We solve them multiple times in order to give us not just a single forecast, but an ensemble of forecasts from very slightly different conditions to assess the probability distribution. The results have to be post-processed, and then the post-processed results may go to the user automatically, but in the case of warnings, will normally be interpreted by a meteorologist first. The second method that's used for forecasting is nowcasting. It's used for very short-range predictions and is essentially a data-driven rather than a process-driven approach. It's based on current or recent observations and is usually tuned to a specific observation source. It uses a very simple model, which is fast to run. For instance, continued motion without change. And it's very much a target for machine learning. It's a simple model that ignores external factors, so it's typically good for what we might say is half a lifetime of the weather regime of interest. And it needs to be updated frequently. And then we can also use statistical methods. And those are particularly useful for hazard phenomena that can't be described by physical processes. For instance, cloud processes are typically millimeter scale, and we can't model at millimeter scale. It's not realistic. They are typically based on historical data, but can also use simulations, and they can identify an expected range of outcomes conditioned on the current state or prediction. Like nowcasts, they are data-driven, and like nowcasts, they have limited validity, which is determined by the training range. So moving to the observations then, and the bedrock for observing the atmosphere now is the satellite. And it's really important that the forecasters, the modelers, and the designers of the satellite instruments work together. It takes 20 years or more to put a satellite into orbit, and it'll probably be up there 10 years. So we need to know the phenomena we want to observe, the variables that characterize those phenomena, the precision and accuracy we need, the resolution we need, the update frequency. Now, the satellite will only observe radiation. So what sources of radiation, what wavelengths, what wave bands enable us to identify these variables, these phenomena? All of that needs to go into the mix and requires a very careful partnership. Ground-based observation, the network for ground-based observations goes back to the 60s. It's coordinated globally by the World Meteorological Organization, the upper air sites and the surface sites measuring variables that are agreed to standards that are agreed. It's subsequently been enhanced by satellites, as we've seen, but also by in situ measurements by aircraft, and on the ground by radar, remote sensing, and by other techniques. But not all of those data are shared. And then there's opportunistic observations. So observations are expensive. They require careful sighting and maintenance. And most countries can only achieve maybe 50 kilometer spacing at the surface, 300 kilometers in the upper air, which doesn't tell us much about the weather in our backyard. So we're looking in our models for data at 1 kilometer resolution. And that means using observations made for other purposes, maybe professionally, as in MODES aircraft data, data from utility companies, intelligent vehicle systems, or data taken by people just for interest. So photographers monitoring the weather for lighting, smartphone observations, and Twitter comments. All of those are potential sources which are not used much at the moment. So that's in its infancy. It requires a new type of partnership to take that forward. So one example then, the terminal Doppler weather radar system was implemented over 20 years from the 1980s, and it has eliminated aircraft crashes due to low-level wind shear from thunderstorm downbursts. Partnership was essential in the whole process. It required field programs to understand the problem, which were mostly undertaken in academia. The warning system was co-designed with the aviation culture and technology in mind. It had to be developed, tested, installed, the pilots had to be educated, and then the whole lot had to be made operational, and has been a remarkable success. Looking ahead, a key science challenge is predicting the initiation of severe convection. We know quite a lot about this now, and we know that our models have skill, but they need to know details of the boundary layer state. We have LiDAR observations, or at least LiDAR instruments that can measure these parameters, but there's no operational system able to do this anywhere in the world. And indeed, there's no partnership that's aimed at producing one. Part of the problem is it's not clear how such a forecast would be used. It would be very short range, and it would be very, very detailed. So that's my take on chapter 7. Just to wind up, here's a set of key messages from across the whole book. I won't read them out since we're short of time, but if you focus on the one at the bottom, the key objective of every warning is that it should be useful in having useful information in its content. It should be usable so that the person receiving it can understand it, and it should be used in that the person who receives it should take appropriate actions. So thank you very much for bearing with us, and I hope we've time for a little bit of discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions from the audience. Feel free to unmute rather than to add it in the chat. We also had some questions that were submitted to us prior. Or there's a question in the chat. Sorry, there's a lot happening in chat. There's a question from Ryan Harris. If you're here, you can unmute, and otherwise I'll read your question. He writes, this challenge is all about trust and connection. I would think most humans are visual oriented. Does the book talk about novel visual methods of warning using AI or computer vision to simulate what an impact may look like for individuals, possibly even based on their values?
It does indeed. Anna, do you want to talk to that one?
Anna, can you unmute and maybe?
Yes, but I think it's not our chapter that discusses use of artificial intelligence for it's certainly a new frontier, but we don't have a direct example of this. I don't know if you can hear me well.
Yep.
Certainly, what we describe is that there is an opportunity of using simulations and using artificial intelligence to be able to improve communication capacities and to better predict as well behaviors, not only to see how different people and to better understand how different people may visualize or act on impacts through simulations, but also using artificial intelligence tools to analyze behaviors after an event based, for example, on Twitter or other analysis of social media.
Thank you.
But this specific case, I mean, I don't know if Ryan, sorry, wants to tell us a little bit more about it, because, or also if Brian, if there is also other chapters dealing with computer vision enhanced artificial intelligence.
I think we don't really go into that side of it, but what we do emphasize is the use of multiple ways of including non-textual and non-verbal ways of presenting information.
Great. In the interest of time, I'll have one more question that was also submitted before the presentations. What are ways for building a warning network community or a warning network between community and weather service?
Okay, I think the example from Argentina is a really powerful exemplar of how to do that. But it takes time and it takes effort. So it means going and talking to people. And one of the key problems that often gets missed is that if you, for instance, go out and organize some public meetings, then a certain type of person will go to those meetings, and the people who are likely to be most vulnerable will probably not be there. So it's really important that that engagement specifically seeks to cover the whole range of vulnerability that you're trying to reach.
Yeah, clear. Thanks.
Maybe, sorry,
yeah.
Briefly adding to that on the co-design, in our chapter, we also address a number of challenges that may be encountered in co-design and co-production of warning systems. But also we present a number of good practices where by working really at the local level with communities, also when it is about designing very localized warning systems. So there is a whole range of different hazards, as also Joanne said. If we have to design an early warning system for landslides, for example, you really need to work together with the community also sometimes simply to let them understand the relevance of the importance of the instruments that will be installed, the fact that these instruments cannot be robbed. So some really basic principles. I mean, I'm talking about this because we are facing these issues in a project in India where we are trying to install a landslides early warning system. So where weather information are coming also in this case into play, but there is also, you know, the multi-hazard element. So it's landslides and weather. And there is a work that needs absolutely to be done with the communities at the very beginning of the process of co-designing the entire early warning system, looking at the entire warning value chain and working with people to also discuss what are the possible options for the warnings and for communicating it. So, well, for example, you know, internet-based communication tool work smartphone application will work in which context. They cannot work everywhere. So all these very specific and contextual aspects need to be taken into account. And I think that in the future, we will hopefully have more and more capacities and skill to work more at the local level. And the more we work at the local level, the more we are able to engage with the communities.
Yeah, thanks for that addition, Anna, and I agree. I just want to have a final round of applause for our speakers. Thanks all three of you to introducing this new book. I think we'll really much look forward to it being published in May. Thanks for being here. And just a heads up that our next webinar will take place May 19th. So that's the week before EGU. And we'll be in touch over the mailing list and on social media with the topic and the speaker of our next webinar. And again, a big thank you to Anna, Brian, and Joanne for their lovely presentations today. Thank you.